We are recording the interview of Lawrence Galaske, Jr. This interview is being conducted by Erica Carter from the Wright State University Veterans Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University and the New Media Incubator. It is 12:09 on June 22nd, 2018. Hi, Larry.
How are you?
I am fantastic. Thank
Great.
you so much for coming out today.
You're welcome.
All right, great. We're going to just get started with some simple questions. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Niles, Michigan on September 6, 1947.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My parents are Lawrence Galaske Sr. and June Galaske, and they were born in 1923 and 1924. And my father was born in Galaske, Michigan, which was a small town of about 750 people. My mother was born in Bedford, Indiana, or that region, and moved to Michigan when they were about 3. We think because of work. My grandfather worked in a limestone quarry in Indiana and came up north of Michigan, evidently looking for better work.
What did your dad do?
My dad, he did various things. He quit school when he was 16. He was a junior in high school and joined the Navy, World War II. Prior to that, he had moved out of the house, his home, and moved to Niles, which was about 15 miles from the small town, Galaske, and he was a bellhop in the local one hotel in town. And then from there he went in the service, and when he came back he worked for Simplicity Pattern, which is, I don't think they're in business any longer, but they made patterns for dresses for homemakers to make all of their own clothes. So he worked at that factory, and that's where he was introduced by his friend, who was my mother's uncle, or my mother's brother. So that's how they met, was at a factory. And then he drove a coal truck for a little while, and things were tough after the war, trying to find a job. He ended up retired as a welder, and he still lives in Florida. He's 91 years old, and my mother's 92.
That is great. What did she do?
She was a homemaker. She actually worked in the factory for probably a year or so, and then after they got married, she just stayed at home and took care of kids.
Do you, okay, so kids, you have
Yes.
siblings?
I have 2 brothers younger. One is 3 years younger. He lives in Florida with my parents, and the other is 7 years younger, and he lives in Niles, Michigan yet.
Okay. What were you doing before you entered the service?
Right out of high school, I graduated at 17, worked in a gas station until I was old enough to go to work in a factory, which was 18. And that was in September of 1965. And I worked in the factory. It was Clark Equipment Company in Buchanan, Michigan. Worked there for a year, and then I went into the service.
Okay, and which branch did you enlist?
I actually went into the Army, but a friend of mine that I was working with had talked me into joining the Air Force. So we went down to the recruiter, and he'd already signed up. And the recruiter told me, we don't have room for you. We have our quota for the month, but we'll send you down as an alternate, because someone always can't pass the physical or the aptitude tests or something. So he said, no problem, you should be able to get in. So we both went down by bus from Niles, Michigan down to Indianapolis, took all the tests, passed everything with flying colors. they told me this is sergeants that were signing us up for different duties. Said you can do anything you want. You have an aptitude high enough. You can you can work on radios. You can electronics, engines, whatever you want to do. So I chose radio repair because that's my dad and my grandfather were both TV repairmen on the side. It was a part-time job. And I thought, well, okay, I'll learn the whole thing, and when I come back, I'll have something to go to work to. We were in the room with the podium. Everyone was lined up, and two people came in, two Air Force, I believe they were sergeants, came in with a clipboard, and they named off 7 or 8 people's names and said, you can get back on the bus, we don't need you. And I was one of those 7.
Oh my.
So I came home. 2 weeks later, I got my draft notice, and I went down to the Army recruiter because my grandfather and my father had both enlisted World War I, World War II, and I was the oldest grandson, so it was not an option. I had to join volunteers for something, which I didn't mind doing. So I went down and joined the Army.
Okay. But you were sent a draft notice. Somebody
Yes,
said
I was sent a draft notice, and when we left home, they put us on a bus and sent us to Fort Wayne, Detroit, and we spent overnight there, and then the next day to the induction station, and of course they were asking, since I was enlisting, what my MOS preference was, and I told them as much as I did with the Air Force, radio repair would work. And they said, well, that sergeant isn't here today to sign you up. And being very naive, I think it was a lot of baloney. But they said, well, what else do you want? And I said, well, what else would there be that would be in the same realm? And they said, well, how about telephone repair? And I thought, well, my fiance's parents and relatives work for Illinois Bell in Chicago, and they all are doing very well. They had management positions and that sort of thing. So I thought, well, yes, telephones, I can learn, the whole telephone industry, and then be able to come back and get a job for one of the Bell systems. Turns out there's not a lot of transfer. They both use wire, and that's about as far as it goes. But it was one of those things where you get hoodwinked. If you don't know, they aren't going to help you much. They made their quota, so that's where I went, was telephone lineman.
Okay, so now this was all before you went to basic training?
That's correct.
Okay, so what happened in basic training?
Well, we were sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and it was October, so it was starting to get a little chilly, and then it got, for the most part, it was, I didn't mind basic. Our platoon sergeant was, our drill sergeant, was not a bad guy. He was, must have been in his 40s or so, and he was, I think he only had a year or 2 left to retire. So, I mean, he was not any worse or better than the others that we were watching in the other platoons, but he was pretty fair. The worst part about Fort Knox was in November and December, it's cold and rainy, and it's hard to get warm. You're soaking wet, and it's 35 degrees, and it's spitting snow, that sort of thing, and you're crawling around in the mud. And of course, the 2 hills, Agony and Misery, at Fort Knox are pretty famous for foot marches.
How long was your basic training?
8 weeks.
Okay. You made it through it.
Yes, I made it through it. It was, it was nasty, but it wasn't that bad. It would have. Thinking back now, a couple of months earlier would have been nice, but then if it's 100 degrees, then it has its own misery.
Yeah, still agony and misery.
Yes.
Okay. Where did you go for your MOS training?
Right after basic, we graduated in the end of December, and or actually it was a little earlier than Christmas. Then we went home on leave, and we were assigned to, all of us that were going to lineman school, we went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and it was called CST, or Combat Support Training. It was not like AIT, Advanced Infantry. It was combat support. And that kind of covered everyone that was not in the infantry. If you were a mechanic, if you were a cook, we were all combat support. So went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and that was January and February of 1967, and it was really cold. We were climbing telephone poles with ice on them. Wow. And we were in very old barracks. They were barracks that were built for World War I. And they were supposed to be torn down, and they were still using them. And they were pretty raggedy. So, but it was, lineman school wasn't bad, other than the fact of having to go out and climb poles when it was freezing cold.
Did you receive any other schooling or training?
No, I did not.
Okay. How did you adapt to military life at this point?
You just learned that whatever they told you to do, just do it, get it over with, and usually you didn't get any hassle. But if you were, I saw people that just didn't like authority, and they would push back, and they're the ones that got pushed a lot harder. So a note, when I was in CST in New Jersey, Jim Croce, who was he's a singer, Bad Leroy Brown, and those, all those songs that he recorded was in our unit, and I was his squad leader. And he had gone home at, let's say we got there just, I said January, February, it actually was just before Christmas that we had to report. And then we went home. He went home and brought back I don't know, about a dozen demo records that he'd made with his wife. And some of us bought them. They were like $5. That was probably a good 3 or 4 years before he had made it big in the music industry. So they were pretty crude. They were like they were singing in a tin can or something. But it was some cheap recording studio. But it was neat because it was a record that he'd made, a demo record. And he was a great guy. He very funny. Probably 3 or 4 years older than us, and he was in the National Guard.
Okay. So
at CST, and from CST, the National Guard people, most of them went home. Mm-hmm. I was sent to Fort Hood, Texas, with the 73rd Artillery. They had just come back from Vietnam. So I spent 6 months in the 73rd Artillery. It was headquarters battery, because we were combat support at Signal Corps. We were in headquarters battery as support. And we spent about 4 days a week in the field, and we could sneak in, since we were commo, we could sneak in for material and that sort of things, and get a shower and clean fatigues and back out to the field. It was started to get pretty warm. Spent 6 months there, and we were, the company was or the battery was self-propelled howitzers, 155 millimeter and 8-inch. So most of the time in the field, they were on the firing tables, and we ran phone wire, hard wire from FDC, the Fire Direction Control, out to the OPs, the observation posts, and the survey teams would be set up out there, and they were watching where the rounds were dropping in. They were firing from about 7 or 8 miles away, and so we supported with telephones, with field phones, and they also had radios, so they had double backup. But scorpions and snakes and chiggers and all of the nasty stuff that Texas has got. That was kind of a miserable time in Texas, because we were in the field most of the time.
Okay, so you're combat ready.
If you want to call it that, we were combat ready. We at least had some hands-on training, and from there, a couple of my friends and I were going to volunteer for Vietnam, and I had heard about the Warrant Officer Flight School training, helicopter pilots, so I signed up for it, and that took me off the Vietnam volunteer list. So of course you have to go through physicals. I passed everything except my eye exam, and I have 20/20 vision at that point, but with my eyes dilated, I was just under the minimum. So the flight surgeon said, you can't go. So it must have been a few weeks later I got orders to go to Germany. And I was stationed in Nuremberg at Merrill Barracks, 2nd Armored Cav Regimental Headquarters.
What year is it?
And that was 1967. Okay. And it was around July. So I'd spent my time in Texas and then shipped off to Germany. And that was, so far away from home, I hated it for a while. But it was, I was assigned to the communications room, and we had radio teletype machines, and it was regimental headquarters, so it was, with being a regiment, they had all of the lines coming in from 7th Army for communications, and then they had all the lines going out, radio actually, to the squadrons that were guarding the border. So we were kind of the hub in between. And in the message center area of the communications room, we would log messages in and out as they were being transmitted or received. And then we would classify them, whether they were just marked classified or whether they were secret or whatever. And then we would deliver them to the appropriate offices in the headquarters.
What was your personal life like? So that's what you did at work. Did you have a recreational life?
No, partially because we worked 12 on, 24 off. So there was nothing to do, and most of the time we didn't go downtown much. You'd go to the EM club and have a beer, but other than that, for about 6 months while I was there in that position, we didn't do a lot. 12 hours on, and then sit around and have a couple of beers, and then you slept. And it was a rotating type assignment. So
so this is where you probably got most homesick. How did your parents feel about you being in Germany?
Well, we wrote back and forth, and they asked what I was doing, and they had a lot of questions because I had been assigned, I had been assigned a top secret clearance. So the FBI would come around the neighborhood and ask neighbors about me, and asked friends, and I guess their their method of investigating is they ask if they knew me and then who else they knew that knew me. So they would go down the line, and I had people that knew the family would call and ask why the FBI was calling them about me, and I couldn't tell my parents anything other than, don't worry about it. I'm not in trouble. So once I got a top secret clearance, I volunteered for a job in the regimental headquarters, and moved out of COMO, out of the comm center. And I was the distribution clerk, which was kind of like internal mail, but you'd order all the forms that the regiment used and the squadrons used and send those out. But I worked for a major, and he had moved to S2, and of course that's all the classified material. And he asked if I knew how to run a printing press. And there was one in the distribution room. There was one in the back room. And I did not, but it was a commercial brand, and there was a company downtown in Nuremberg that sold the machines. So I was allowed to go down and basically pick their brain on how to get this machine up and running, and so I experimented with it, found out how to run it, and then I began printing all of his classified materials. At the same time, they made me a classified courier, which meant that any classified material that came in or went out of the regiment, that it had to be hand carried. Then I carried that either to the airfield, where it would be picked up by a helicopter, or dropped off. And of course it was all packages that you didn't know what was in it, but it was stamped with a certain classification, and then it was numbered. So you would go through and anything that you received, you would check those numbers off to make sure you had everything that you were supposed to get, and vice versa. The couriers that were coming in would do the same thing. The other place that we went was we went to the Bahnhof for the train station, downtown Nuremberg. And there were two couriers that would come in by train every day, it was like Tuesday and Thursday. We would go over in a corner of the train station, and we had the big bags that looked like mail bags, canvas and leather, and they had padlocks on them, and we had a 45 on, with live ammunition and all of that. Walk over in the corner by ourselves and open the bags up and dump them out on the floor. Sit there and count them out and sign for them. And then they would get back on the train and go to their next stop, and I would come back to the headquarters and sign all that material back into S2. And that was kind of a nice job, because I was gone sometimes, depending on which run I had to make. I had 3 or 4 different stops that I made locally, plus the train station. I would not be there for lunch, so they gave me a separate rations card. So I could, with separate rats, then I got extra money, so I could eat on the economy. So I could eat downtown or wherever I wanted. And it was much better than the mess hall. And we had a snack bar, and the snack bar was pretty good. So I had separate rations. I was exempt from duty because there were times that I was working late at night printing, and I had a guard at the door and that sort of thing. And they moved the printing press, went from upstairs on the main floor down to the basement in a cage. So I was basically with a guard and locked in, and may print things for whatever they needed, copies for a couple of hours. And then my job was to destroy all of the material that did not, that was illegible or whatever as you're starting to set the press up. So I would have to do that.
And how did you destroy it? Was it fire?
Yeah, we had a burn barrel out back of the building, and it was basically on. It was a 55-gallon drum with holes cut in it and a little trap door, and it was setting horizontal on a set of axles and stands. And you open it up, dump all the material in, light it, and then you would, as it burned, you had a hand crank and you would turn it until it broke all the ashes up and they fell through the holes, and basically, it blew away with the wind.
That's neat.
So, but it was, that was interesting. I'd never read anything that we printed. It was, most of it you didn't understand what they were talking about anyway. But I was, my office was right next to the Command Sergeant Major's office. So if you worked in headquarters, you had to be what they call strack. So we were still wearing the old cotton fatigues. We didn't get jungle fatigues till we went to Vietnam. So we were wearing the cotton fatigues, and you always ordered them through the laundry with heavy starch. So you actually had what we called break starch. And in order to put your pants on, you had to run your hand through the pant leg to get it just opened, because they're glued together. And then, so you had these very crisp, starched collars and pant legs and sleeves that felt very restricting for at least a day or two. And it was hard on the fatigues. They tended to wear them out a little faster, especially in all the joints. But you had to make sure you had a clean haircut and clean shaven, spit shine boots, all of that went along with it. But if you followed their rules, I never had issues with the officers or the Command Sergeant Major. Basically, you try to become invisible. You do your job and stay out of their way. But they knew you were there. They would speak to you, and it wasn't as much as I hated being away from home, being away from the States, the land of the round doorknob, as we called it, because everything in Germany was all lever-type handles, door handles, and it was a pretty good tour of duty, and that was 16 months.
Okay, so 16 months in Germany.
Yes.
You kind of got up in rank there as far as your position.
Yes, I became a Spec 4, and I decided I was going to try to apply for helicopter flight school again. Okay. So I went to see the flight surgeon.
Are you still in Germany?
I'm still in Germany at that time, and that was after about a year. So I thought, well, let's see, maybe, my eyes have changed or something of that sort. So I went to the flight surgeon and did the whole physical, and he said, no, you still can't make it. So, all right. And about 2 months later, he called me and said that, they've lowered the standard. You can get in now, but do you know why you can get in? And I said, well, I assume because they need pilots. He said, yes, they're losing a lot of pilots. So, if you want, then you can get into flight school. The major that I was working for, of course, he had to sign papers and that sort of thing, and he knew that I was putting in for it. And he called me in and told me, you don't want to do this, because at the end of the war, all of those warrant officers are going to be basically booted out. They won't be needed. What you want to do is go to OCS, and then you can go either rotary, helicopter, or fixed wing, or both, and you'll have a career. So I thought about it for a few days and went back and told him, okay, I'll give it a try. So he said, well, good. Since you're going to volunteer for OCS, I am going to sponsor you for West Point. And So I filled out the forms, and he submitted everything, or however it was done, and they requested, of course, education and that sort of thing. And it turns out I didn't have enough math or English, and the rule was, I believe that you had to go 10 months through 10 months of prep school before going into West Point. And if you passed prep school, then you got your assignment to Point. And you could not be over 21 years old when you got out of prep school. At that time, I don't know what the rules are now, but at that time, so I was basically, they sent a letter back and said that you'll be too old. You can take refreshers through USAFI for your math and English, and you can get the credits that you need. But by the time you do that and go through prep school, you'll be too old to enter West Point. So I got turned down. And it was about a month later that I got orders to go to Vietnam.
Okay, and so you're going to Vietnam as a telephone?
Yes, I was a telephone lineman. And when I left Germany, I got an Army Commendation Medal and for the work that I'd done. And they also promoted me to Sergeant E5, which changed my MOS to Wire Chief. So at that point, they gave me a long leave, and I had 45 days before I went to Vietnam. And that was in November of 1968. And I came home, and we had plans, my wife, or my fiance and I had plans of coming home for that Christmas in '68, getting married, and coming back to Germany. And I had a car lined up and an apartment lined up, and they had a program called European Out. So when you were supposed to ETS out of the military, you could actually stay up to another year, and they would pay, the Army or the government would pay to have all of your belongings sent home and pay for you to go home. So you could spend a year and travel and work or whatever you wanted to do in Europe. And so that was the plan. Those plans got disrupted by my orders to Vietnam.
Okay, quick question.
Sure.
Your fiance, was she stateside or did she come?
She was
Germany?
stateside.
Okay.
Yeah, she was stateside, and that was the plan. Was we were going home. I was going home at Christmas. We were going to get married, and she was coming back with me.
All right. So this has changed now.
That changed. Everything changed. So I got home, and I said, do you want to get married anyway, since I'm going to Vietnam? And she said yes. So in 2 weeks, her and her cousins planned a whole wedding. So we were married about 2 weeks before I left for Vietnam. When I got into country in first part of January in Vietnam.
Quick question. Who were you attached to? What base were you attached to when you went to Vietnam? Or
we didn't know. It was when I went over, I just had orders to report. And it turned out in Germany, I came down on a DA levy by name. And they couldn't get me out of it because they said, you don't even have a year left in the service, so you shouldn't be going. And they said, we'd much rather have you stay here, but the regimental commander tried to have me taken off the orders, and they couldn't do it because it was by Department of the Army by name, but there was no assignment. It was just said Republic of Vietnam. So when I went over, I had no idea where I was going other than when I got to the induction station. Well, first I had to report to Fort Dix, New Jersey. That's where we left from. And I spent 3 or 4 days there in January in Class A uniform, dress greens, because when I had left Germany, I had sent all my fatigues and my duffel bag home, and they never got home. So I got married in dress greens, Class A's, which is what I wanted to do. But I reported to Fort Dix, New Jersey in those same dress greens. And from there, we went to California, to Oakland. We flew, and then from Oakland to Hawaii, and then to Guam, and then into Tan Son Nhut in Saigon. And the night that we came in, they at that point they were still using all commercial chartered aircraft. So it was like a L-1011. It was Braniff. And so they had all regular stewardesses. That was when there were females only, the stewardesses. And Braniff painted their airplanes different colors. And this particular one I can remember was purple. And all the stewardesses wore purple uniforms, mini skirts. So it was our last treat. So as we're getting ready to land at Tan Son Nhut, the aircraft circled, and they said, we're going to have to make a quick landing because the airbase is under attack. And as they flew over, you could see tracers going across the end of the runway. So they evidently got clearance. And they said, as soon as we land, everyone off the aircraft as fast as you can, and you're going to be moved right to the bunkers. And since we didn't come over, we were all coming in as separate ordered, with separate orders. We weren't coming as a unit. We didn't have weapons. We didn't have any fighting gear at all. So we get off the plane and run to the bunkers. And it was a short time after that, maybe half an hour or so, that everything was cleared. And then we went to the induction station, in-country reception station, I should say. And I spent 2 days there and waiting for orders, because I still didn't have anything other than report to Vietnam and a 90th replacement. And I asked about getting some fatigues, and they said, you can't have anything until you get to your permanent station. And I said, but I'm in winter dress greens, the heavy wool, with my overcoat, which I threw away. But they said, sorry. So I had to go buy socks and underwear and all of that sort of thing, because we didn't have, I had nothing. Got my orders, and I was sent to Chu Lai, which is about, it's on the South China Sea, and it's way up north in I Corps, 23rd Infantry Division, about 45, 50 miles south of Da Nang. And they flew us up, and I got to their reception station, and I had to spend another couple of days because they have to do in-country jungle training, which means that they run you through the gas chamber, and they run you through booby trap simulation, jungle paths, all this sort of thing, and re-qualify with weapons. And I'm still in dress greens, the same ones, and they actually have holes in the knees and things now from crawling around, and they really began to smell. Oh, so, because it's about 5 days, and it's nice and hot. So I finally get orders, and they, every morning of course, you had formation, and they called out my name, and this guy comes up and said, okay, come with me. So we hopped in a Jeep, and he drove me about probably 300 or 400 yards north of the reception station to the company area of the 71st Assault Helicopter Company, and that's where I was stationed. And we pulled up. I went in and reported to the first sergeant, and he had several comments. One was, you know, why are you wearing winter Class A uniform? And I explained that to him. He said, okay, we'll get you over to supply and get your gear issued. And then he looked and he said, you are a Sergeant E5, and I don't need a Sergeant E5. I need a Spec 4. And he said, you only have a little less than 9 months left in the service. Why are you here? Because the rule was minimum 12 months to be assigned to Vietnam. And I told him I had no idea. He said, well, you must have made somebody mad. I said, I don't know. He said, well, I don't know what to do with you. And I thought, well, you could send me home. And that was probably the best laugh he'd had the whole time he was there. He said, we'll find something for you. So my duties became, in the beginning, I was the sanitation NCO, and the A&R NCO, Athletics and Recreation. So I had the keys to the Connex container that had all the sports gear. And then I was assigned to an E6 sergeant in avionics down on the flight line.
I'm dying to know, what were your jobs as a sanitation?
I had about 12 Vietnamese kids. I mean, they're 13, 14 years old. They came in every morning on base, and this was a closed base. It was a Marine Corps Commandant ran the base, 50,000 troops. So they would bring all of the hooch maids and all of the other people that, Vietnamese that worked on the base. They would bring them in by deuce and a half, and every morning someone from the mess hall or from motor pool would drive out to the main gate, pick all those people up and sign for them, and then drive them back to the company area, and then they would go about their assigned jobs. All the hooch maids went to their own hooches, and of course the hooches we had wooden, plywood buildings that were built up off the sand with sheet metal roofs and screens on the upper half of the walls with flaps that drop down to keep the rain out if we got a monsoon season, if you get storms. So everything was plywood and hot, naturally. And we were we were probably 300 yards from the South China Sea. So all of our hooches were sitting in sand, and that's all there was around us was everything was sand. So we had to have we had metal pallets that you walked on for sidewalks. Otherwise, you were trudging through the sand all the time. No hot running water. They had the showers were drop tanks from aircraft, and they would screw in a fitting with a valve and a shower head on it. So you had, and sometimes it wasn't too bad. You had cold water, but at least you could take a shower. And that was part of the job of the Vietnamese that I had. The sanitation NCO is they cleaned all of the showers, the officers, the NCOs, and the EMs. They cleaned all the latrines. And cleaning the latrines was basically, they were all outhouses that were set up on platforms. And the backside had a flap, and you had a 55-gallon drum that was cut in about thirds, with a couple of holes cut on the edge of it so you could grab it with a hook. And they would drag those out because they were under the toilet seat. You drag them out, and they would dump diesel fuel in them and light them with a big wad of toilet paper. And they would burn them every morning. And the smoke would drift through the whole company area. It was, you wanted to stay upwind.
Okay, so your other job was A&R.
Yeah, and A&R. But now the sanitation NCO also, I had Vietnamese who would go around and pick up all of the dead rats because the place was crawling with rats, and we'd put warfarin out, and they'd eat the warfarin and it would kill them. And they would crawl into our bunkers, and the bunkers are about halfway buried in the ground with 55-gallon drums filled with sand, and then culverts over the top that had sandbags stacked on them. The rats would get in and they would die in behind the barrels, so that, the whole place always smelled dead. So that was part of their job, is I would have them go dig all the rats out and clean the latrines and clean the showers. And that was an everyday. It wasn't bad. I mean, they did all the work. I just had to make sure they did it. And keep track of them, because they're kids. So they would rather sit around and play and talk with each other. You couldn't understand what they were saying. I did not learn much Vietnamese. Anyway, that was their job all day long. Part of mine was I get them finished, and then as far as A&R NCO, if anyone wanted a football or a basketball or baseball, whatever sports equipment, I had the keys, so I could unlock the Connex container. It was a big steel box, and issue it. And I never did that because I was signed for all of that equipment. And if you've ever been any place like in a combat zone, those guys don't care. Leave the football on the beach, take the basketball in their hooch. It doesn't get signed back in, and then I'm responsible for it. So and they didn't care about playing with that stuff anyway. We had the South China Sea, and the beach was really nice if you had any time off, because we worked 24 hours if we needed to, and it was 7 days a week. So that was my daytime. It was my part-time job, and then I worked down on the flight line, working on helicopters, all the communications equipment, replacing radios, fixing battle-damaged wiring and components that died, that sort of thing. And I did that for the 9 months that I was there.
Okay. What did you do in your leisure time?
Other than to have a beer once in a while at the NCO club, I remodeled my little cubby hole of the hooch. Now, the hooches, for the most part, were wide open when they were built. So I went out, and there were several of us that went out and scrounged extra plywood, and we built our own little room. So I did a remodel. I boxed my room in. I took a 3-speed fan that I bought at the PX and put that in the window and built it in, and took the controls for it and mounted them next to my bunk. And then I found an extra mattress, so I converted the standard military steel bunk into a bed, and I got some vinyl. We were building the NCO club, and there was extra red, which was a mistake, but it was red vinyl that they used for the bar, and I upholstered my bunk. The back, the side of it, and the bottom of it in this red vinyl. And then I found tile, and I tiled the floor, and I found the perforated ceiling tile, like it was in the orderly room. I found a whole box of it, so I put up tile in the ceiling, and it was actually it was nice enough that whenever they had an IG inspection, they would take the inspectors to my hooch first and show him my room. And when I left, I sold it for $50.
That was big money.
That was big money. Well, yeah. And when I was making $400 a month, that was big money.
How did your wife feel about your newly married? You're gone to Vietnam. How was she doing?
She did okay, but of course we wrote almost every day, and I still have stacks of letters packed away. Of course, I went over in January. In June, they told me that I could go on R&R, rest and recuperation. And I had several of the guys that wanted me to go to either Bangkok or Singapore or to Sydney, someplace like that. And I said, no, I'm going to go to Hawaii, and I'll meet my wife in Hawaii. So trying to, this happened fairly quickly, that they said, you're up for leave and you need to, schedule it. So I found that we had a Mars station that the Marine Corps ran. I went down to the Mars station and was able to get on. You have to schedule a time. Got on and left a message, meet me in Hawaii on this day, and we will be there for a week. And of course they relay it to the States, and then the States, they actually relay it by telephone. And so she gets this message that says, meet me in Hawaii on this day. And so she had to schedule a ticket. And of course, my flight was free, and I think she got a discount on it for being a spouse. I'm not sure anymore. But we went to Hawaii for a week, and that was our honeymoon.
Uh-huh.
So.
Okay, so finishing up our tour of duty in Vietnam, because you did the rest of your...
Correct. I did my full, when I came back, I actually rotated or ETS'd out of Vietnam about 2 weeks early from my normal 3-year tour. I was supposed to get out in October 4th of 1969, and President Nixon was beginning to wind down troops, and so some of us got a week or 2 weeks shorter tour, and I was one of those that my orders came through 2 weeks early. The orderly room called me in one day and said, you have, tomorrow you have half a day to clear post and catch an airplane to go home. So you get your orders, grab a Jeep, and of course you have to go to medical to be cleared, and to admin headquarters, and those people don't care. They're not going home. So it's like, I only have a half a day, and I got everything cleared, begged, pleaded, whatever I needed to do, and I got everything cleared and got to the aircraft about 10 minutes before they were going to take off.
Wow.
They said, you just made it. So I flew from, and these were little C-123 Caribous, not a large airplane. Flew from Chulai down to Tan Son Nhut, got off the airplane onto a bus. They took us across the airfield, and as we got off the bus, they said, there is a airplane ready to leave right now. They need like 12 people. And I happened to be getting off the bus like the third or fourth one. They said, go. So within 2 or 3 hours of leaving my company area, I was on an airplane flying home. And that was probably one of the scariest flights I ever had, because I made it this far, and we're flying over the ocean. I know this thing's going to crash. So, but we ended up, we flew into Alaska, to Anchorage, and I'm still in jungle fatigues at that point. And they'd taken all of my old gear away from me and gave me all brand new. New boots, new fatigues, everything. And we got to Anchorage, and it was about 40 degrees out and 70 in the terminal. And we were there for probably an hour and a half while they checked the aircraft and refueled it and whatever. And we about froze. They were giving us hot coffee and trying to keep us warm. We get back on the plane, and we flew into Fort Lewis. And at Fort Lewis, right off the plane.
Where's Fort Lewis? I think
That's in Washington.
Okay, Washington.
Yeah, right outside of Seattle.
Okay.
And we went in, and the first thing they do is it's supposed to be a big treat. At that time, it was a tradition that you had a steak and egg breakfast. Well, it's an Army mess hall, so steak and eggs was okay. But you know, it was home food. From there, you went into processing. They took you over to supply and measured you, and they looked at your orders, and they fitted you for back to Class A uniform again. And it was September, so they were summer greens yet, a little lighter weight. It was about, we spent overnight and got up in the morning. They issued we went and picked up our uniforms. So we got brand new shoes, all brand new uniform with a trench coat. And all of our insignias were sewn on, or our stripes, and all of our brass and everything was on. And whatever ribbons we had, hash marks on our sleeves for overseas duty and all of that. And went to payroll. They gave me my last pay and gave me an airplane ticket to Chicago and took me to the airport. We had the military buses. Got out of there and didn't see much of anyone. It was kind of late during the day anyway. Didn't see hardly anyone that was protesting at that point. We'd heard that, you know, beware, but they were not allowing us to wear civilian clothes. We didn't have any. So I flew in uniform, got to Chicago, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I called a taxi cab, and they drove me out to, my wife was still living with her parents, drove to her house, and I called her up and said, I'm home first. And that was it. I was out of the service, and we drove back up. Her uncle owned a cottage at a lake in Michigan, and she was from Chicago. But that's where the cottage is where they spent all their summers as kids. And that's where I met her, was from a friend at this lake. And her uncle let us have the cottage for 6 months after I got back, until we could find an apartment or a house or whatever. And we bought a house.
How was your readjustment from active war to suddenly done and I'm home?
It was strange in a lot of ways. When I got home, as soon as I got home, I went back to Clark Equipment, to personnel, and to see if I had a job yet. They were a union shop, so by contract, I had worked at Clark for a year prior to going into service. By contract, I could get my old job back. So that job was filled, but they gave me one similar. And I went back to work 3 days after I got home. The only reason it took 3 days is because it was a weekend. and they had to wait till Monday for me to have a physical to come back. I went on, I didn't have much seniority, so my seniority carried on, so I actually had 4 years. But I was still, I went on night shift, and I worked midnight to 8, from midnight till 8 o'clock in the morning. Not many people on there on the shift, and most of the guys never said boo, you know. And the department I was working in, I had not worked at before, so they didn't know me. A few of them would make a comment now and then, but other than that, I didn't talk about it, and they didn't ask, and we just left it at that.
So speaking of talking to people, did you keep in contact with any of your fellow vets from Vietnam?
I did not at the time. Several years later, I tried to contact some of them, and especially a couple of the guys that were in the hooch with me. And I found one. There were 3 of them that were from Ohio, and I knew where they had been, and I ended up being able to track one down in Cleveland. I called him, and it was interesting. He was into street rods and, you know, in cars, and I was into cars. So by this time, we had moved from Michigan to Ohio, and he said that they would go to, every year they went to this place in Owensboro, I believe it is. It's called the Pumpkin Run, and it's a big street rod get-together. And him and his wife both had street rods that they'd built. So I said, well, that's great. You know, we can meet there. And he said, yeah, I'll let you know. And didn't hear from him. Called him back afterwards, and he basically just kind of blew me off. I don't think he wanted to face any of it. Then several years later, I was able to find one of the other guys, and I have pictures of, I didn't take many pictures, but I had pictures of us together. We were, you know, 3 buds. In fact, they worked for me. I taught them how to climb telephone poles and work on wiring and that sort of thing. He was really, he owned his own business, but very radical as far as his attitude towards, you know, well, it wasn't a war and we shouldn't have been there and all, you know, it was just a lot of negative. So we just left it at that. He didn't want to talk about it. And then I found one of the other guys that was one of the radio repairmen that I knew, and he's up around Chillicothe, and he belonged to the American Legion and the VFW and all of that, and we would email back and forth. Had a lot of kind of common interests, but he said he'd like to come down and visit, and or I could come up that way, but his wife was really sick, and he had a lot of, he was, you know, trying to deal with that and had a lot of issues, and we just never got together. And that was, and then a couple of years ago, I had one picture with one of the other guys in the hooch that was a radio repairman, and I couldn't remember his name. And I sent that picture off to one of the other guys, the guy in Chillicothe, and he said, oh, that's Eric, and his last name. So I tracked him down through, I belong to our company's association. The 71st Assault Helicopter has an association and a website. And he belongs, and he lives down in Kentucky. Not far from the racetrack, the NASCAR track. And I sent him a letter. I tried to call him, and the phone didn't work. So I sent a letter and a copy of the picture. I said, remember me and all of this, and never heard anything back from him. So not much, hardly any contact with them. I've run into other people that were there at the same time in other companies and you know, served in the same time in different capacities and like you say, a couple of Marines and we have some common ground and we don't talk much about over there, but you know, just as friends now.
You mentioned being a part of your company's organization. Are you affiliated with any other organizations?
DAV. I belonged to VFW for a while, and I also belonged to the American Legion for a while. And I dropped both of those. Most of them, I joined just to pay the dues and help support them and support other vets. And they seem to want, you know, they like for you to volunteer for different things, and I don't do that. When my dad got out of World War II, he was in the Navy, joined the National Guard, and he joined the American Legion and the DAV, and he was commander for our local American Legion post, which was only 3 doors down from our house when I was a kid. So I belonged to the SAL, Sons of the American Legion, and I held the state commander's office and the regional district, I should say, commander, and our squadron, which was a local post level, all at the same time when I got drafted. So I ended up, I went to one last convention and said, you know, someone else has to take these jobs. But SAL, we did, I had a lot of grandfathers. Being in the American Legion, there were a lot of, you know, World War I at that time were grandfathers' ages, and a lot of extra dads, because everybody's watching out for you and making sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. It was like the Boy Scouts. I felt I had served my time with the organizations as far as volunteering.
Well, what do you do now? Well, what did you do after?
As far as work or
Yes,
hobbies,
work.
or I worked at Clark Equipment and got into an apprenticeship program as a welder, and spent about 2 years in that. And in the mid-'70s, we had the economy downturn. So the company came to the union and said, we have to lay off workers. And we don't care who we lay off, we just have to, it's going to go by seniority. They went to the skilled trades and said that we're going to have to lay off people in the trades also. And the skilled trades, same local union, there was no differential between trades and the shop floor. But they said, you're not going to lay off any tradesmen. You'll have to lay the apprentices off. Well, the apprentices are indentured, and they're not considered workforce. So there were 52 of us that got laid off, and we went through the National Labor Relations Board and arbitration and all of that. And there was no precedent to lay off apprentices, but they did. So, and there was no way to get back into the program. So I ended up, I had a friend that I went to high school with who was an engineer, worked in their research and development labs. And one of my managers was one of my classmates in high school. And the engineer and the manager were friends. And the engineer said, we need a welding technician. And so the manager said, give Larry a call. So I got a call, and he said, do you have a resume? And a resume, I don't even know how to spell that. So I wrote up a resume and turned it in, and I got the position, and it was 30 miles away, So it was a long drive every day, but relatively speaking. But I started working in one of the R&D labs at Clark. And Clark Equipment made lift trucks, heavy off-road equipment, bobcats, and all of that sort of thing, industrial equipment. I was there about a year, and one day a industrial robot showed up on the floor, and from Cincinnati Millicron. And it turned out the president of Clark and the president of Millicron were on each other's boards, and they decided that Clark needed a robot. So they sent it up to R&D, and they wanted to weld with it. And I was the welding technician, and they said, would you like to go to school? And sure. So they sent me to Cincinnati, and I spent 2 weeks here at Millicron and learned how to run the robot, program it. And I did development work with it for the various divisions of Clark. They would send parts in, you know, can you weld this, can you weld that? And the people that were most interested was Melro, Bobcat, and they're in North Dakota. It's a division of Clark at that time. So after about a year, I got a call from our director, the manager of the R&D facility, and he said, we are shutting this facility down, and Bobcat wants the robot, and they want the technician, not the engineer. They want the technician that runs it. And you would have to move to North Dakota from Michigan. A couple of the engineers that I worked with said, you don't want to go there. It's 40 below zero in the wintertime. There's nothing out there. It's absolutely like wasteland. We've been there. You won't like it. So the director said, if you don't go, you know, you would need at least to go out and visit and hear what they have to say, because if you don't go, you're going to be laid off. You'll be on the street. So I got a plane ticket. They gave me a plane ticket, and I went out, and they wined and dined me. They showed me, they said, we would like for it to go in this plant, but if not, then we'll put it in one of the other plants, and you'll have your choice of which plant you would rather be in, but you're going to have to drive back and forth, you know. So I said, well, I don't know. I'll have to talk to my wife. And they said, okay, well, go home. We'll get her a plane ticket, and you two can come back out, and we'll show you all the sights. Not much to see in North Dakota, but at that time there were about 620,000 people in the whole state. And the temperature ranges from 104 in the summer, not all the time, but sometimes, to 40 below zero. And the first year we were there, it ran 40 below for a week with a wind chill of about 98 below. Wow. And when I got there, they actually gave me a title of manufacturing engineer, and I was in charge of the whole weld shop and the robot, and I ended up putting 7 robots in. I picked the projects. I had a design engineer that worked on fixturing for me, and I put automation in their plant for them. But they were tyrants. They thought they owned you, and it was, you know, they'd call me 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, robots down. And they wouldn't give me anyone that I could train to help. So I'd get up and go in and work, you know, do whatever they needed. And most of it was just stupid stuff. You know, an operator would know it. He could fiddle with something, and then it wouldn't work right, and then he could sit.
So did it feel like the military?
Yeah, so it was crazy. And there were a lot of times that they actually gave my wife a job also in the office. But she would go home at 5 o'clock, and I would be there until 9 or 10 o'clock. So she'd have to find a ride home. Now, we'd go to work together, but then most of the time she'd have to find a ride home. And I finally got tired of it. I had 18 years with the company, and I quit. I resigned and I applied at Cincinnati Millicron since I had the robot experience, and they were looking for welding application engineers, and I was hired, and that's how we got to Cincinnati.
Okay. What are some life lessons that you learned from your military service?
Life lessons from
Being in the military?
being in the military?
Or did the military help you in your life later?
I didn't, for the longest time, I didn't think so. I thought I just spent my time and that was it. What I learned was that, you know, even though they tell you not to volunteer, there are times that you have to weigh the opportunity and go for the gold. That's how I got from being in the, when I was in Germany, in the Commo Center, in the Message Center, over to regimental headquarters. They needed someone, and they said, we need a volunteer. And I asked, you know, what do you do? You know, I didn't want to be in the mess hall washing, you know, doing KP and washing pans. And they said, well, this would be the job, distribution clerk and classified courier, and so that sounds neat. I'll try it. And it was a very good job. It was, you know, I exempt from duty, didn't have to make formations, all of that sort of thing. And I learned that the same way in Vietnam, you know, there were things that I was sanitation NCO and A&R NCO. That wasn't by choice. But I was, when I went to avionics, I liked that job. And the NCO that was in charge, there was a warrant officer that was the officer in charge, the OIC. But the E6 was rotating out. And the first sergeant said, you know, you can be, at least temporarily, because you're only an E5, you can be the NCOIC of avionics section because you're doing such a good job. And it was, and I went out and worked with the other guys. It wasn't one of those jobs where you sat behind a desk. You know, I liked going out and working on the equipment. And you just learn that if there's an opportunity, you need to weigh it, and there's a good possibility it'll all turn out.
Okay. Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed during this interview that you would like to discuss?
No, other than, you know, there are times that I think I didn't do enough, that the guys that are in the infantry, they're out on the ground, you know, because I saw them, you know, being in a helicopter company. You see the guys every morning. They had a mission, you know, and they're either they're being inserted or pulled out or supported or whatever. And I asked to be a gunner, and they said, the first sergeant said no, and he gave me the excuse that I was a sergeant E5, so I was basically a platoon sergeant. Really didn't have a platoon, but he said it's a leadership position. And we're not sending you to gunnery school. Plus, because I was so short in time, that it was, you know, it just didn't. He just wouldn't let me go. I Sunday gunned, which is anytime the crews were trying to get a little downtime. And if they had missions where they were going to Da Nang to pick up supplies or someplace else where it was not into combat, we were allowed to take their place. So I did that whenever I could because I liked flying. But just recently, I had mentioned that one of my hobbies is military vehicles. Now, for some reason, as I get older, green kind of and I are attracted to each other. But I have an old military truck, and I just recently bought an M151 Jeep, which is the same vehicle that we would have driven in Vietnam, that I drove in Vietnam, same type. And the gentleman that I bought it from was in Vietnam the same time as me. He was a Sergeant E5 in the infantry, went Special Forces, and retired as a colonel. He's got 7 Purple Hearts.
Wow.
And it's, what did I do? You know, not that I want a Purple Heart, but he spent 30 years of his life, you know, serving his country. And, you know, I spent 3 years, a little less. Did I do enough? I don't know. I made sure that the helicopters were up as far as radios. They were in the air every day. And without us, they don't fly.
So what you did was very important.
So it's, you know, when you know, in retrospect, it's an important job. But I've been to one of our association's conventions. They have them every 2 years. And the pilots and the crews are a very tight-knit group, and they stick together. The rest of us, all the support team, not so much, because we're just the ground crews. You know, those guys are the ones that stuck their neck out. They were in the air. But we, you know, sometimes they forget that we are the ones that allowed them to do their job. The same with the infantry. You know, if they wouldn't have supplies, ammunition, whatever they needed, but still, there's times that, you know, you think, well, maybe I could have done more. I don't know.
Okay. Well, what message would you like to leave for future generations that will hear this interview?
That war is a waste. It's absolutely a terrible waste of people and time and economies. You know, we throw billions of dollars at something to kill people, and you know, why can't we have peace? You know, I don't regret going when I went. I went for my country. I believe in our ideology of freedom and compared to some of the other communism and that sort of thing, but it's still, there has to be some way to negotiate without the violence.
Before we get to the violence.
And it's you know, I saw some things and it just, yeah, you think, yeah, I've lost some people over there that well, that's just.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for your service.
You're welcome. It was my honor.
I would like to conclude this interview with Lawrence Galaske, Jr.